question or comment, David?
First of all, thanks for this great panel. Great to see many of you. And Lauren, it's terrific that you're pursuing this degree. I haven't seen you in a number of years, but I have a question specifically for you. The time period that you're talking about, right, which is right after actually the time period that Carma was mentioning in terms of the turn in the copyright, I think a lot of that has to do with what Robert Wiebe refers to as a search for order, right? It's a time in American culture that turns to professionalization, and particularly around data and management of data. And so I'm wondering if you've seen that in other facets of the fashion industry as well, right? There's this move towards sizing, and then so how do you size the body in terms of the body that is seen as different or larger, right? But can you talk about ways that you're connecting it to other facets of the fashion field, or if you've seen it in other cultural moments or other cultural issues at the time?
Yeah, I've kind of had my blinders on for the past 5 years, just looking at stoutware. But an interesting thing that I did see in my research that pertains to stoutware was that in addition to, Albert Malson, Lena Bryant's husband, was very much a businessman. He was a mechanical engineer by training, and whenever he met Lena, she was designing maternity wear up in Harlem, and he saw her designs and realized that they would be widely applicable for larger bodies as well. So one interesting thing kind of along these lines in terms of like professionalizing fashion was that he took out patents for her designs. Like one thing that she had invented was a dress that had an expandable waistline that would grow with the wearer throughout the term of her pregnancy. And so if you go on Google Patents, you can search his name, and he took out like 15 or 20 patents for various garments for pregnant women and thereafter stout women as well. So yeah, I agree, it's a really interesting time, and one that I think deserves more attention from scholars, because one thing that I talk about in my thesis is about how American ready-to-wear is oftentimes framed as this single mass market for a single American woman and a single American consumer, but and then like business scholars don't really talk about market segmentation until the 80s in sources that I've seen, but in the sources you can see that they're doing this a lot earlier, where they're like identifying specific consumer groups within American ready-to-wear too. So there's, I think, a lot of work to be done. Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, Ken?
Yeah, I have a question for Carma. I know nothing about IP design, but the narrative one might tell in literature or moving image is that it gets stricter in the United States as the years go by. So do I have that wrong, or is design sort of an anomaly in relation to some other areas of intellectual property?
You're right that, wait, is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. You are correct. I would say it does get stricter, and in particular, although the US does not, we still don't let you copyright just like one of these chairs. Nope, not going to happen here. Whereas in Denmark, no problem, you could do that. And the UK, you could do it. The terms of design patents and utility patents have both increased since they were, the 19th century, and they've steadily both increased. Yeah, I mean, I could go into more detail, but that's the short answer. Yes, they've gotten stricter, and certainly our copyright regime has gotten way, way, way.
Right, but there is this anomaly about the functional version of objects is a specifically American thing.
That is kind of, as far as I know, that is specifically American. There is legislators, even though, like, they admit at times, at least courts admit, judges admit, that it's hard to distinguish, like, okay, the Cuisinart food processor. So which parts there are like strictly functional and which parts are like decorative or ornamental, and could they even be separated? But I would say within US law so design patent laws were created in 1842, and if you think of American design at 1842, there was like train engines, that were like functional, the functionalist stuff. And then most of the decorative arts, the decorative designs were like very decorative, very ornamented. So, and I think the idea of design at that moment was that it meant applied ornament.
Got it.
Not so much chairs like these or the Arne Jacobsen chairs out there, right? So I think that distinction from 1842 gets codified and never really is given up in the United States. The distinction between the purely useful and the ornamental, and it obviously does not really work, and it's been a problem ever since. But it's a distinction that has remained very important in U.S. law, is what I would say.
Right, thank you.
Julie?
Hi.
How design education might have restricted or encouraged copying for designers?
That's a good question. I mean, even today, I think you can find examples of authors who will say, hey, copy. I actually feel like I just remember, it's not Austin Kleon, it's somebody like that who says, you know, copy the things you like, and eventually you will arrive at your, oh my gosh, no, it's some famous artist. Anybody know who I'm talking about? It's like copy things you like until copy until you eventually arrive at your own, you'll arrive at your own personal expression of that thing that you like. I want to say it's not Matisse, but it's some famous artist. There are variations on that theme. Japanese, like Kenji Ekuan, I'm not even saying his name right, also says something about Japanese sensibilities, like that you copy to assimilate, right? To assimilate, and then you eventually kind of shift to something new that fits with your culture. So I feel like that's an idea that's been out there in many cultures and for a long time. Design education, I'm just going to lay it out. Nobody really, as far as I can tell, ever has done a good job ever in the US of explaining to industrial design students the difference between copyright and design patent, and like what you need to do to actually protect your rights if you want to get a design patent, i.e. don't post it on Instagram and don't put it in your exhibition and don't disclose it publicly at all until you've filed for a design patent. Nobody knows that. Like, design students never know that, and we do a really kind of terrible job of helping them understand that here, I think.
If I may just say, as from the European point of view, what for me is very interesting what you say is that when I think about the pop art with which I grew up in the 70s in Germany, and we had very good American art collections around, that people like Andy Warhol or Rosenzweig and also Jasper Jones, they worked on the idea of the copy. And so they kind of declared the popular art from the billboards to be copies which became artwork. You know, this is a kind of, from the free art or from the high art, kind of same approach, you know, which is a very specific American phenomena which makes pop art so very successful and so very important for Western art at that time. But it's a fantastic topic to think about, you know, imitation and creation.
Elizabeth?
Well, actually, just to pick up on that, Ulrich, when I was seeing your images go by, thanks. When I was seeing your images go by, you were talking about that change from the in the academic tradition away from the schools of the Royal Academy into the more decorative art training that started to take place. And I wondered there if they were doing based on copy as well, because we all know, you know, in the academy where the art students would come in at age 11 or 12 and just start copying everything that was put in front of them. And I wondered, was that the same thing, same kind of training then?
Yeah. There wasn't enough time to develop this today, but they had a very good corpus of engravings, which they were copying from. And those engravings were drawn, the models of those engravings were drawn from the Royal Picture Collections and from the Royal Material Collections. So you would have copies of a Raphael, as well as Lebrun paintings, but also a Sèvres vase, which was a very famous vase, which was just been made for the king. And the last thing before the start of the revolution was fascinating. Louis XVI had bought Vivant de Nantes collection of antique vessels and vases, and they were engraved in line engravings, and given to the students. So the interesting thing is what here again the academics made the veto that they were not allowed to do 3D copies. So there was never a human figure and never a real object, which of course was there, because in France rules are always made to be gone by and being played with. And so we know that they had life models of animals and of human figures and of course of objects in school. But there was this thing that if you keep them low as industrials, you may not give them the same training as you give to the real academic artists.
We have one more question here.
Thank you. Hi, Lauren. That was really interesting. The images you showed, some of which were directed towards wholesalers and retailers, who were, I assume, principally men, whereas others were advertisements directed, I assume, principally towards women. Is there anything that you've thought about or discovered in comparing and contrasting the types of images and the claims made on the one hand to the wholesalers and retailers, on the other hand to the customers themselves?
Yeah, that's actually something I've been thinking a lot about, but doesn't really have like a home in my thesis. So I think it's a really interesting thing to talk about, this gendered dynamic. So like I look at trade journals, and I kind of like do this behind the scenes, front of scenes thing throughout my thesis, where I'm looking at, these conversations that were happening amongst manufacturers and retailers, where on the one hand, they were just trying to figure out who the stout woman was. So they talk about her in these really kind of offensive terms. Like there are these debates about what even do we call her, and how is she different from her slender counterpart, and basically like what's her problem, like both physically and emotionally as well. Like you get the sense that the stout woman's like very maladapted in those sources. And then on the kind of like front stage sources, like the advertisements and catalogs and even style guides and stuff, there's this, on the one hand, they're establishing the idea that the stout woman needs to dress to look more slender. Like that's the imperative of their design discourse and what the function of stoutwear should be. And then the way that manifests within the front stage sources is, they're selling her this idealized body of what she can be. And the only place where I feel like I really saw real women's voices coming through, who are kind of serving as a counter to this like very masculine idea of like reshaping the body, like in some sources they're actually talking about the body as architectural and wanting to resculpt the body and stuff. Like it's really powerful and interesting. But then like in the style guides, you have a different take from, in one instance there was one written by a stout woman who was talking about how, dressing in this manner can provide opportunities, and how, you'll be able to go out and work and fit in society and things like that. So there's definitely a different agenda at play, as well as an awareness of things that, these men designers and manufacturers could say behind the scenes versus what they actually said to stout women themselves. Like I think that these industry sources like trade journals are just a fascinating resource for, seeing the kind of unvarnished conversation and mechanics of design discourse.
So I have a question for Tracy. I was really fascinated by your comment about Marchioni's drawings as a visual manual of comportment. And I wondered, was that something that was being reinforced, that comportment, or was this something that was pushing new ways of interacting?
It's not something new in culture more generally. It's new that it appears in architectural drawing. So there are manuals of comportment circulating in
Right,
Europe.
so this was reinforcing that.
Yes, it's
Okay.
just a kind of visual imagery that had not appeared
whatsoever. It's a kind of imagery that you might see in grand tour painting, like nude painting, but then the figures are minuscule. And Marchioni is making this sort of equation, the architectural body, between the body and architecture. The bodies are as architectonic, as significant as the architecture itself. So that's sort of where the novelty lies.
One last question? We'll go back here.
Yes. So the way that
drawings have been talked about in the scholarship as theatrical, I think that's a very general term in a way. And what's interesting about Marchioni is, in fact, he also was a scenographer, and he was very active in the theater, in his local theater. He is a great caricaturist, so he produces hundreds of figural drawings, and I have an idea, a thesis, which is that some of what's happening here has a lot to do with what he's doing in his caricatures, and in his own sort of very active participation in street life. So that's a whole other kind of part of the project. But yeah, I think that theatricality is very specific.
I think we really need to conclude right now. One more.
to collectors in the 18th? Did they appeal to collectors in the 18th century as well?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think. Today, I did not show any presentation drawings. What I showed
highly finished, but they're clearly not presentation drawings. Princeton owns one presentation drawing. We don't really have any in the Cooper Hewitt collection, but the Albanis certainly have this huge collection of drawings. They're collecting Carlo Fontana. We know other architects like Bernardo Vittone are visiting the Albani collection and, again, copying, learning from those drawings. So I think so. But, you know, there's not a lot of information. So I'm sort of working on that tangent as well. Thanks.
Okay, we need to conclude right now. Thank everyone here on the panel. It was excellent and really fascinating. And we'll be returning after a lunch break.